Welcome to the first video in the Working with Model Data module, where we focus on tables and external data within Simio. Note also that the material for this module comes primarily from two sources, from Chapter 7 of the Simio and Simulation textbook and from Chapter 6 of the Learning Simio training series. Within Simio, the data window that we see here on the Data tab is the central location for Simio data, and we can see that we have a number of options here, a number of different types of data tables, and we'll consider most of these in this video module. We'll consider data tables in general, arrival tables, sequence tables, lookup tables, rate tables. Schedules and input parameters will be covered in their own dedicated video modules. Many models use large amounts of data, and we use this data to describe objects, to describe arrivals, and other things within the model. Simio uses an internal structure for its data, so basically all of the data is read when the model starts, which provides faster access to the data. Simio can represent simple tables or complete data sets with multiple relations, and we'll see what that means during this video module. Also note that the data schema for Simio tables are completely user-defined. Simio tables use a standard column and row structure that we see in spreadsheets and in relational databases. And so you can see that a table is made up of a set of columns and a set of rows, where each column is a standard property or reference to an object. And so columns in Simio tables are strongly typed, defined by the property, and a row represents one piece of data or one element of data that includes each column. There are two primary mechanisms to access data in a Simio table. There's a direct access, which includes two different syntaxes. One is just the table name with the, in brackets, row number, comma, column number, and also table name, bracket, row number, dot, column name. So either one of these two can be used to directly access a data element or a data item in a table. An important part also is the ability to set an active reference, so set a reference to a row in the table to a Simio object. Once we have an active reference, then we can simply access that row using table name, column name. So for example, in our table, if we named column 1 C1, column 2 C2, and so on, and we're interested in, and so back up for a second, this would be row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, and row 5. If we're interested in this element, we can reference that. Let's also assume that we just use the default name of table 1. Then we can reference that row or that particular element by table 1 bracket 3 2 or table 1 bracket 3 C2. Both of these will directly access this. Or if we've set a reference, so if we for example have an entity and we set a reference to the row, then we simply access it by table 1.c2, and the table reference itself will handle determining the row number. And so we'll see examples of these as we move forward through the video. Also note there are two additional functions that we see. One is available row count, which tells me how many rows obviously there are on the table. And secondly, we have something called random row, which lets us select a row randomly using the property value to determine the probabilities. Again, we'll see examples of these as we move forward in the video. So through this module, we're going to use Simbits for demonstrating some of these table functionality, and we haven't used Simbits in this video module before, so let's just jump in and look at how to do that. So I go to Simio, and I'm in if I go to the support tab and then just click on the Simbit solutions, that brings me to the Simbit search page. And the Simbit that we're looking for initially for this module is select entity type from table. So I just start typing and Simio will filter the Simbits accordingly. So we want select entity type from table, and then we get the Simbit that we want. So when I click on the link, Simio brings up another copy of Simio, and the Simbit will have a PDF document that describes what the Simbit is and how the Simbit is used. It'll also describe step-by-step instructions for how to create the example, which we don't need for now because I'm going to do that purpose. So for this Simbit, what we have is we have three different entity instances. So we have something called Part A, Part B, and Part C, and if we just run the model, you'll see what's happening is we're creating entities in a random sequence or a random order based on type. They go to the server and then they depart. And the key to this Simbit is that we're using a data table to define the three part types and the relative mix that we'd like to for the source to create. So if we go to the data tab, we can see that we have one table called product table, and our product table has three columns. If we just click on part type column here, we can see over on the property window that this is an entity property. So we've created a column called entity property, and of course once we define that property as an entity, then we have access to our three predefined, or the three types of entities that we have already defined. So we see our part type A, part type B, and part type C. We have a product mix column, which is a real property, so we have a real number property. And then finally we have a process time property, which is an expression property, which lets me hold any expression. And so we can see that we have one row in the table for each one of our entity types. The product mix table is what we use to determine the relative mix of parts that we create. And we'll see that when we go back to the model and we look at the source, and we can see that we have defined, let me just make this a little bit bigger, here in the table reference assignments, before entities are created, we've created a reference to the table product table. And for the row number, we're using this product mix dot random row. And so what the row number lets me do is specify which row in the table I'd like to set the reference, so the entity would have a reference to. I can put a real number, I can put an expression, or I can use this function that says choose a random row. And so in our case, if we go back to our data, we can see that the product mix defines the relative probability. So if we add our product mix values together, they add up to 100. And so part A will be created with probability 50%. Part B 30, and part C 20. So that defines the mix that we'll see. So when an entity is created, Simio will choose a row randomly, create a reference to that row, and then once the reference to the row is set, we can specify the entity type by just using the product table dot part type. So we don't have to specify the row here because the row's already been set with the reference. So it automatically knows which row to go to and then choose the corresponding part type. Also know that we have the green arrow here, which lets us know that we are having a reference property. Finally, when we go to the server, we can see this is where we access the process time. So we can have individual process times specified by the row number. And so again, when we set a reference to a row, we have access to the part type that lets us create the correct part. And we also have access to the process time so that we can have part type dependent processing times in our server. So to summarize, what we did is we created the table first. Actually, we created our three entity types first, and then we created the table so that we could define the product mix and the process time by part type. Once we had the table created, then we could create the table reference in the source object. So the source object created the table reference, chose the row randomly, and then set the product type. And what's not shown in the slide is how we use that process time in the server module. And so you can see by using the table, it's easy to create these multiple part types using a given product mix and then directly have access to the process time so we can have the type dependent processing times. So the final thing we'll do in this video is we'll introduce another example that we'll be using in subsequent videos. This is model 7.1 from the Simio and Simulation textbook, an emergency department using a data table. And this is very similar to the Simbit that we just saw, but as I said, we'll be expanding this in subsequent videos. And so what we see is we have an emergency department that has 4 different patient types. So we have routine patients, moderate patients, severe patients, urgent patients, and the priority that the patients would see in the emergency department is determined by the patient type, with the highest value first on priority. And we can see that we also have different treatment times based on patient type. So let's have a look at this model. Go back to Simio. We can see here's our Simio model. Of course, let me put this in 3D mode. Of course, it looks a little better in 3D mode since we're using our person symbol here. You can see we have the source, the server, and the sink that we talked about previously. And if we go to the data table, we see a table that's very similar to the one we saw in the Simbit. We have a patient type column, which is an entity property, and we specify our 4 entity types. We've added a priority column so that we can give priority to the urgent patients, and so we define that as an integer property. We then have treatment time minutes, which relates exactly to the process time that we saw in the previous video, the previous example, and then we have the patient mix, which defines the mix of patients that arrive. Go back to our facility and go to our source, and as before, we created a table reference to the patient data using the patient mix random row, specified the patient type, and then in the server, the only thing we did differently from the Simbit is that we used a ranking rule based on the patient data priority. So once again, because the row reference has already been set, the entity has a pointer to its given row, which then allows us to access, or allows Simio to access that priority, so that we can prioritize the sickest patients first, and then we specify the treatment time as we did before. So again, in subsequent videos we're going to pick up and add some modifications to this model to add some additional functionality.